What would you do if 60 of your bravest sons were killed, not by accident, but by betrayal? In the blistering sun of West Africa, 60 flag-draped coffins lay in silence. Behind them stood a man, not just mourning, but remembering. Captain Ibrahim Traoré did not weep. He did not demand answers. He simply whispered, "They were not just soldiers. They were our voices, and someone tried to silence us." Just days before the ambush, Western envoys had arrived, bearing medals, smiles, and thinly veiled promises of strategic cooperation. But Burkina Faso had said no. No handshakes, no theater, no permission. Then came the strike, 4:38 a.m., communications dead in 2 minutes, drones jammed, no reinforcements, 60 men gone. Coincidence or consequence? This story is not about sadness. It is about standing up. It's about the question Traoré left hanging in the dry air. Do we protect the living or wait for permission to mourn? Stay with us, because this isn't just another story. It's the future our ancestors dreamed of. Subscribe and stand with us for an Africa that will never bow again. At exactly 4:38 a.m., the silence of eastern Burkina Faso was shattered. A swift, calculated ambush unfolded near Dargo, a strategic corridor recently reinforced by national troops. No distress calls made it out. In under 2 minutes, communications were cut. Surveillance drones were offline. Backup forces were blind and late. When they arrived, they found what no soldier ever hopes to see: 60 of their brothers, lifeless beneath the early light. These weren't conscripts. These were elite units, trained and seasoned. Many were fathers. Some had just held their newborns the week before. The youngest was 19, the oldest 38. Wrapped in national colors, their bodies returned to the capital by noon. As the sun climbed high, so did the morning. But in the war room of the Cuba presidential complex, there were no tears. President Traoré stood unmoving. He did not call for pity. He did not summon outrage. He turned calmly to his chief of operations and asked a single question. Do we have satellite trace of any foreign aircraft in the last 6 hours? No response, just silence, just lowered eyes. The next morning, Ouagadougou came to a halt. Government buildings displayed banners of the fallen, schools shut down. Across all 13 regions, the entire country entered mourning. But as the tears flowed, so did suspicion. Only 4 days earlier, the president had refused a U.S.-led award ceremony. Officials called it routine diplomacy. Traoré saw it as something else: bait. A performance masked in politeness. He declined the handshake. He closed the door. Now 60 were gone. In the mosques of Bobo Dioulasso, elders gathered for prayer, but outside in the courtyards the murmurs turned to questions. So this is the cost of dignity? One man asked, gesturing toward the radio. This is what happens when a country refuses to kneel? No one had an answer. At the University of Ouagadougou, students took their outrage to the walls, spray painting a new slogan: "Our dignity has a price, and we are paying it." Across the nation, the grief became fuel. National media dropped the language of grief and replaced it with the lexicon of resistance. Strategic retaliation. Coordinated message. Deliberate silence. One headline read, "Refuse the West, and they remind you who still holds the trigger." But Traoré didn't react like the world expected. He didn't accuse. He didn't panic. Behind closed doors, he reorganized military ranks, issued new defense orders, shifted logistics. There were no cameras, no press, just determination. A quiet expansion of the country's strategic command was already underway. For Traoré, this was not just war. It was memory, and memory, when sharpened, becomes a weapon. The African continent had seen betrayal before, had buried heroes before. But what happens when a nation learns from its pain, refuses to bow, and instead builds with the blood of its fallen? That morning the capital stood still, but inside every home, every village, something stirred. Something old, something deep, something ancestral. This wasn't just about Burkina Faso. This was about Africa reclaiming its voice. The capital did not remain in silence for long. Silence is for the defeated. And Burkina Faso was not defeated. It was awakening. President Ibrahim Traoré emerged, not to beg for empathy but to issue orders. He gave no speeches. He refused the photo ops. Instead, he walked straight past stacks of foreign condolences left at the presidential office, envelopes laced with polite regrets and diplomatic distance. He looked out the window at the people gathering in the square and said to his chief of protocol, "We do not mourn with permission." There would be no public apologies, no international press conferences, no wreaths from those who had once offered strategic partnership. What the country needed was not sympathy. It needed a plan. That evening, Traoré traveled under heavy guard to the outskirts of Ouagadougou. Hidden behind rusted gates stood an old vehicle maintenance facility, unused since the days of Sankara. The locks were broken. The floor was cracked. But the president stepped inside and placed his palm on the steel wall. He turned to the engineers waiting quietly nearby. "We build here," he said. "We build now, and we build with our own." 3 days later, the first shipment of drone shells arrived, not from the United States, not from Europe, but from local mines and workshops, mined, melted, molded by Burkina-Bayans. This was not an act of vengeance. It was an architecture of deterrence. A presidential directive followed immediately, the creation of a domestically led drone weapons program. No foreign advisors, no imported consultants, just Burkina-Bay scientists, engineers, and military tacticians. The blueprint, confidential. The ambition, unshakable. Across the country, whispers grew into conversations. In cafes, in courtyards, in classrooms. "They're building something," people murmured. "But it's not just weapons, it's will." Operation Colpelgo was launched, a sweeping civilian defense initiative that would span all 13 regions. Community centers became readiness hubs. Former school teachers became instructors. Farmers became scouts. Mechanics became drone fitters. And the people? They didn't just volunteer, they lined up. In Banfora, a retired colonel reviewed the new curriculum and shook his head, not in disbelief, but in awe. "This is not revenge," he told a reporter. "This is memory, turned into muscle." Students in Djibo started writing code for drone surveillance. Hunters in Funora taught teenagers how to read terrain. In every district, AI-enabled radar systems were deployed to detect low-flying aircraft. And at the center of it all stood a belief. Burkina Faso would never be caught unready again. Was it painful? Yes. But pain can do two things. It can paralyze or propel. Traoré chose the latter. This wasn't just a shift in strategy. It was a national recalibration. As one student in Ouagadougou painted on a wall, "We bury the dead, but we don't bury our courage." And the courage was spreading. Word of the transformation reached African capitals. From Bamako to Niamey, leaders began taking notes. What Traoré had launched was no longer just defense. It was a movement, a quiet revolution of readiness. And for the first time in years, African news headlines weren't just reporting on crisis. They were reporting on clarity. They called it Operation Colpelgo, not a war plan, but a survival doctrine, not a military exercise, but a mindset. In the wake of the tragedy, Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just reform policy, he rewrote the meaning of national defense. In his vision, every village, every school, every elder and child would become part of a new defense web. No longer would protection be outsourced to generals in faraway capitals. It would be local, it would be communal, and it would be relentless. Each of Burkina Faso's 13 regions received a directive: establish a civilian defense academy within 30 days. These weren't traditional barracks. There were no concrete walls or iron gates. Instead, they were part classroom, part training ground, half chalkboard, half command post. In Manga, the first of these centers opened its doors. The curriculum was simple, but revolutionary. One teacher opened her lesson with a map of the continent and a single question. "This is Africa. They say it is poor, but why is everyone trying to take from it?" Students listened, not just with ears, but with posture. These were not just lessons. These were weapons. Elsewhere in Kaya, a veteran of the Malian front stood before a group of school leavers and said, "Because we allowed it, but not anymore." From carpenters' guilds converting warehouses into field centers, to elders training youth in terrain recognition and wildlife tracking. A new kind of national literacy was spreading, war literacy. But not the kind that glorifies battle, the kind that understands why one must be prepared. In Yako, teenage girls painted a mural the length of their school building. At the center stood President Traoré, arm raised beside a freedom tree they had planted with their own hands. Below it, the names of all 60 fallen soldiers. Each tree was named after one of them. Each plaque read, "You fell so we may rise." Traoré visited one of these schools unannounced. The students stood. One girl stepped forward and handed him a folded paper. Inside, a handwritten poem. "We do not learn history to remember the pain. We learn it to name our enemies." He read it quietly, folded it again, then said, "Then name them well, and never forget to name yourselves first, as guardians." In Toma, carpenters taught how to build reinforced shelters. In Gawa, scouts taught boys how to navigate by starlight. In Dori, elderly griots turned war chants into drills. It wasn't just education, it was mobilization. This was not theater, this was doctrine, one born not in textbooks but in trauma. Across the Sahel, observers from neighboring countries began arriving, curious, alert, inspired. Some brought questions, others brought their own youth to learn. It wasn't long before discussions began about replicating the model across the region. And all of it, every step, was powered by ordinary people. This was the genius of Traoré's vision. Defense not as institution, but as identity. And so, for the first time in a generation, Ibrahim Traoré, Burkina Faso, became more than a political headline. It became a philosophy. A call to not just stand, but understand. 48 hours after the attack, a gray, unmarked aircraft landed silently at the Bobo Dioulasso airstrip. No press, no ceremony, no preconditions. Descending from the ramp were 11 Russian special operations instructors. They didn't come with documents to sign. They didn't arrive bearing aid packages or veiled threats. They came to work. But this wasn't Moscow's mission. It was Ouagadougou's terms. President Traoré had not begged. He had not sent envoys or raised white flags. Instead, he stood before his cabinet and declared, if they wish to support Africa, they will do so with dignity, or not at all. This wasn't military dependence. It was calculated cooperation. Every drill was designed jointly. Every order remained under Burkina Bay command. Instruction manuals were translated into French overnight. There were no foreign flags, no mercenary firms, no echoes of past colonial security schemes. By the third day, those Russian operatives were already deep in coordinated training with elite local forces. They drilled in urban counterstrikes, border defense, and drone interception tactics. Meanwhile, Western embassies issued statements of concern. Think tanks in Paris and Washington drafted policy briefs with urgent titles like Russia's Advance in the Sahel or Burkina Faso's Dangerous Turn. But inside the country, no one was panicking. They were preparing. Traoré's leadership was not about choosing sides. It was about choosing sovereignty. No more outsourced defense, no more foreign bases, no more borrowed intelligence. Burkina Faso would build locally, train natively, deploy independently. And the world noticed. In Washington, the Pentagon began requesting satellite updates on Burkina Bay troop movements weekly. In London, editorials shifted tone, from intrigue to alarm. But inside Kaya, something very different was happening. In the village square, children painted murals, not of foreign generals, not of flags they didn't recognize, but of farmers holding rifles, of software students with laptops, of engineers designing drones and chalk on blackboards. In Tikere, griots composed new chants, blending resistance with rhythm. The headlines were changing, the images were changing, the tone was shifting. One foreign analyst said it clearly. This isn't about conflict anymore, it's about clarity. African news had been dominated for decades by narratives of dependency, crisis, debt, instability. But now, a new language was emerging. Burkina Faso was no longer asking for safety. It was defining it. And for those who still questioned the wisdom of aligning with Russia, Traoré offered no apology. He simply said, if you aim a drone at our people, we will aim resilience back at you. This wasn't the start of war, it was the end of waiting. Burkina Faso had stopped asking for protection. It was learning how to protect itself. Revolutions don't always begin with gunshots. Sometimes they begin with a tree, 60 of them to be exact, each one planted for a fallen soldier, each one rooted in the soil of a grateful nation. Next to every sapling a plaque, "You fell so we may rise." This was not just remembrance, it was resistance, it was cultural mobilization. Traoré knew that the heart of any lasting defense is not in weapons, but in people, in spirit, in pride. That is why he called on the Ministry of Heritage and Identity, not defense, to lead the next phase. Dancers were enlisted to choreograph resistance drills. Musicians turned protest chants into national anthems. Ironworkers began crafting symbols of unity. Traditional hunters taught youth the art of terrain reading and survival. Even seamstresses began stitching camouflage into ceremonial robes. Everywhere the message was the same. We do not wait to be saved. We prepare to survive. In dusty village squares, elders recited poetry that no longer just mourned, it instructed. In Ziniare, a blacksmith named Kango sharpened his tools, not for trade, but for teaching. 3 local schoolboys arrived with scrap metal and a single sentence: "We're ready to learn." Across the country, 13 civilian military hubs were constructed, not fortresses, but half classroom, half command post. A place where a farmer could learn drone logic and a school child could trace signal maps with a finger on a screen. In Batié, artists repainted every mural in the town square. In place of sorrowful eyes, they painted raised fists. In place of broken chains, they painted circuit boards and antennas. Resistance, yes, but not just in muscle, in mind. The Ministry of Finance, under Traoré's order, took quiet action. A confidential plan for economic delinking. Trade maps were redrawn. Currency reserves were reallocated. Talks with China began, aimed at building a gold-backed reserve unit for regional use. No longer would CFA or the euro dictate the pulse of the Burkina Faso economy. This was no longer just strategy. It was philosophy. A new doctrine emerged, whispered across boardrooms and barracks, schoolyards and souks, one that no textbook had written before, one born of necessity, loss, and vision. Total defense sovereignty, digital and diplomatic resistance, civic militarization. This wasn't extremism, it was clarity, and for those watching closely, it was contagious. Observers from Mali and Niger arrived. Chad requested briefings. In a secluded location near the Sahelian border, a historic meeting was held. 3 flags, 1 table, no apologies. They called it the Wall of Resistance. From this quiet ground arose something that no empire, no economic sanction, no surveillance satellite could stop: self-definition. And while analysts in Paris or Washington debated the danger of this shift, people across Tikare, Banfora, and Ouahigouya didn't care for labels. They cared for one thing: freedom. In cafes and churches, in barbershops and WhatsApp groups, one question rippled like thunder across the Sahel. Is independence dangerous or just inconvenient for those who profit from obedience? The answer was not shouted, it was built. In workshops, in training grounds, in songs. Burkina Faso had stopped reacting. It had begun reprogramming. This was never about revenge. It was never just about 60 coffins lined beneath a searing sun. It was never about responding to fire with more fire. This was about something far deeper. Burkina Faso didn't just bury its dead. It planted them into soil, into memory, into policy. What began as mourning became mobilization. What began as betrayal became blueprint. And what began as tragedy today stands as testimony. Testimony that Africa need not ask permission to defend itself. Testimony that dignity, once awakened, cannot be undone. Testimony that from the red soil of a forgotten outpost, a new doctrine was born, not of bombs, but of belief. President Traoré did not just lead a country, he reframed what it meant to lead at all. His hands were not lifted in surrender, but in resolve. He stood not behind bulletproof glass, but beside welders, teachers, farmers, and teenage coders. And together, they crafted not a reaction, but a future. The African doctrine of retaliation was never meant to echo colonial patterns. It was meant to shatter them. It wasn't forged in the barracks of a foreign power. It was written on blackboards, painted in murals, whispered in prayers, and shouted in classrooms. And now the question passes to you. What side of history will you stand on? Will you scroll past, or will you rise with those who refuse to kneel? If this story stirred something your grandfather once stood for, don't scroll past. Like, share, speak, subscribe, because the drums of Africa are beating again, and we must march in rhythm. Type in the comments, New Africa, Sovereign Voices, we defend, one continent, Africa rises now, because they buried our voices for too long. Now together, we speak our future.